All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, December 7th of 2021. We've got a 10-game NHL slate on tap, a 3-game NBA slate tonight, and those shorter NBA slates are not really my favorite. Find it a little bit harder to get an edge with the less games on the slate. Also less likely that we get some impactful late swap news, especially when we get down to those 3-game and smaller, even 4-game NBA slates and smaller. Really not my thing. I actually think I'm going to end up probably sitting the slate out tonight, to be completely honest. But curious what you guys think about those. So if you like NBA shorter slates, if you like smaller slates for NBA, let me know. Shout it out into the chat. Leave a comment if you watch this after the fact, and let me know why, what you like about the NBA shorter slates, because I'm curious what you guys think about those and if you like them. I've always been just much more partial to the bigger slates, definitely more my speed, but I figure that's probably not true of everybody, and somebody out there is waiting all week for these Tuesday and Thursday shorter slates for NBA. So was just curious, thinking about that a bit today. We do have some really great questions on tap for today's show. As always, if you've got a question, if you've got something you want to ask, fire it off into YouTube chat, fire it off into the Office Hours channel in Slack. We'll get to everything in roughly the order that these questions come in. But going to start here with a question that I'm actually going to spend quite a bit of time on here. We got a very good question in from Jack via support here about, I guess at a surface level here, some of the black boxiness of SaberSim, things that aren't maybe as visible as you might see on like a traditional tool, how to deal with that, how to know what SaberSim is doing behind the scenes, where the best opportunities are to add value, and also how to judge if your process is correct or right. So I'm going to go ahead and get into that. I'm going to start all this, though, by grabbing this question here and reading it. And we'll go from there. So let's get this started here. And I'm just going to go ahead and, first of all, I'm going to pull up the app because the reflection on my glasses still freaks me out. And then we're going to read this question here. So the question says, been a SaberSim user for 3+ years now. Big question, biggest frustration is the black box feel. Essentially, what is SaberSim already solving for? And what is it not on a more advanced level? Been around a while, so I understand it's solving for correlation and ownership. However, is it ownership on a player level, a lineup level, or both? Furthermore, does SaberSim in any way attempt to optimize the portfolio of lineups when playing 20 or 150 max, or is this a major area for a value add? Love SaberSim. At the end of the day, biggest frustration is when I run cold. It's hard to figure out if it's me or bad variance since I don't know the ins and outs of what's happening. I'm profitable, have been profitable with SaberSim. Really just want to fully understand where I can add the most value as someone who takes this very seriously, works very hard to get better. For example, furthermore, where should I avoid tweaking at all costs because SaberSim is already accounting for? We lost the rest of the message. It finishes already accounting for when building. So clearly a lot to unpack here, a lot to talk about. And I actually wrote for this particular question, I've got even like a little bit of an outline of how I want to answer this. So really awesome question. So I want to start this here by saying, first of all, that we have a general sense and an understanding overall that there are some black boxes here in the app, whether it's the actual individual lineup building process, which like even in this email, we get correlation, we get that ownership, we get that the sims are used in the lineups, but not always totally clear exactly how those things come together into building a lineup. The SaberScore, we are very aware that that is a bit of a black box. Black box, first of all, I know I'm kind of taking advantage of what this word means. I know what this word means. For those of you that don't, it's basically referring to something that like the inner mechanics of how the thing works are somewhat hidden. That maybe you put an input in and an output comes out, but what actually happens, the machine doing the thing is black. You can't see inside it. You can't see how it's working, right? That's what I mean. And that's what this user means when we're talking about a black box here, right? And we're aware of the fact that some of these things in the app are a little black boxy. And on our list to improve the app as we move forward is to make these things more transparent, whether that is making it more clear how SaberScore is coming together, how we're quantifying lineups at the end in terms of maximizing EV, the lineup building process itself. All of this stuff is on our radar. to improve in the app and also to improve in content. So first of all, because it's mentioned in this question of, let's see, is ownership and correlation and things like that being factored in on the lineup level or the player level, I think it would help if I started here by just doing another kind of basic walkthrough of how a lineup is actually constructed on SaberSim, the actual individual process of how we get to a lineup from the inputs, to help clear up some of this stuff. I think it's very easily seen on a sport like NFL. So I'm actually going to hop to NFL instead. Higher correlation sport just makes it a little bit easier to see how the pieces come together. So we'll do like lineups for this past week's main slate. So okay, so let's go ahead and say that we were building lineups for 20 max over 50K entrants or something like this, and here we go, right? So the basic version of how this is working, of how a lineup is put together, is that the very first thing that happens is when we're putting together a lineup, the sim variance slider selects a random sampling of the game simulations for the games in the slate, right? So at high, we're taking a relatively small subset of game simulations and then taking the projections that each player scored in that game as their projection for that particular lineup, right? Then for each player in the pool, the player's projection they scored in that individual set of game sims is compared to how relative to the ownership fade slider. The higher the ownership fade slider is, that player gets a multiplier on that number based on whether or not they are higher or lower owned than average at the position. So if you have two wide receivers that in that particular set of game skims both scored 25 points, but one is projected 30% owned and one is projected 5% owned, there's a multiplier that makes the 5% owned player a more attractive option to the builder from there, right? Then what happens is a player is entered into the lineup, probably like the highest overall scoring multiplier player between sim variance and ownership fade, right? A player is entered into the lineup, right? The next player that gets entered into the lineup, there's a correlative factor based on how high the correlation slider is and how correlated that player is to the first player in the lineup that adds the second player into the lineup. And then we'll basically just continue adding players into the lineup, making sure where we can that they are correlated using the individual like player score is essentially what it is of the combination of the player's ownership and their projections that they scored in that individual game sim. So all the lineups then end up getting built that way. So now let's go ahead and build some lineups here. So then what happens to these lineups is obviously there's other things going on here. If you have minimum salary or stacking rules or min uniques, right, there are other restrictions put on the builder. But broadly speaking, that is how the average lineup is built, at least with default settings, right? So thinking about this here, that really happens on a player-by-player level, right? Every player kind of has this combined projection in that set of sims with ownership multiplier player score, where players are compared to one another when you're thinking about adding the correlation of the lineup. But really, the lineup is built player by player, right? The component of judging lineups on a full lineup level happens here on step 3 via the SaberScore. So the SaberScore looks at the lineup as a whole, compares this lineup's total raw point scoring upside to the total correlation of the lineup itself and the ownership of the lineup, and makes a determination of how high the upside is, right? So these lineups are graded on the whole, where the lineups are originally constructed by using the sliders to input player by player, and the lineups are graded on the whole in step 3 via SaberScore. So the answer here of like this question, is it ownership, correlation, etc. on a player level or a lineup level or both? It is both, but it's at different parts of the process. So in the lineup construction part of the process, it's thinking about this more on a player level. In step 3, it's thinking about this more on a lineup level, right? And all of this obviously is directly related to where the sliders are set. So the SaberScore and how lineups actually get constructed are dependent on what the individual sliders are set at. So I do think that kind of helps. Now, one thing, again, we want to do here is we want to improve the transparency of SaberScore in general and say maybe in the future, one thing we've talked about doing is saying like this is the correlation value of the SaberScore, this is the ownership value of the SaberScore, and this is the variance value of the SaberScore. So you could compare and you could say these two lineups have the same SaberScore, but this one does because it's a much lower owned lineup, and this one has a high SaberScore because it's a much more correlated lineup, etc. Something we've talked about here, but that's kind of a little bit of how the lineup building process works here. So thinking about, from here, when we're talking about adding value to the process, the one thing that I think SaberSim does excellently and kind of already accounts for here, something that I don't think the concern of adding additional value needs to be focused on this particular section, is taking these inputs, right, in terms of projections and ownership, as well as whatever contest you tell us you're playing, and doing the lineup construction portion of the process, building a viable set of lineups for the contest, right? Not only just the construction of these lineups, right, that I just talked about, but the grading of the lineups at the end, all other things being equal, right? I would not, what this really means is I would not spend most of your time when you're trying to figure out a way to add value on SaberSim trying to take these inputs of the slate and build better constructed lineups than SaberSim will do by adjusting sliders or making very heavy use of stacking rules, because one thing, or trying to create individual player combinations, right? We don't even have player groups, but like trying to force certain like groups of players together in that way, because the lineups themselves, the lineup construction is probably the thing that SaberSim does the best overall, right? And I think why this is a big pivot and why it can be a little bit challenging, especially if you're used to going back and forth between SaberSim and other tools, is because that is basically what most of your process ends up being on a traditional optimizer, right? A traditional tool is going to only optimize for average projection. So your process, what you feel like you are doing on an average slate, is setting a lot of the rules to do all the things that SaberSim actually excels at on its own. You have to set the player groups to make sure that the lineups are taking into account correlation. You might be setting ownership sums or caps or weird conditional ownership rules, like make sure that there's a 5% owned player in the lineup, or if there's two 25% owned players in the lineup, make sure there's a 1% owned lineup, right? All these things that end up really directly affecting the construction of lineups that you're going to spend a ton of time on a traditional optimizer are actually the things that SaberSim does the best and are probably the things that are least deserving of your time and attention on SaberSim. You can add little bits of value, I think, here or there, especially if you know that you're going to be particular about what particular stacks you use in your lineups, right? NFL, maybe you know that at the very least you want a QB +2 in all of your lineups, right? Things like that are fine. That doesn't take a lot of time to set the stacking rules. Maybe in baseball, you want at a minimum 4 players from the same team, right? SaberSim is going to give you most of those lineups to begin with, but maybe that that's at the very least you want that, and setting those kinds of things are fine. But that's not where I would focus most of your attention. So where can we focus our attention? Where are the highest value places to add value overall with SaberSim? I think the biggest one, or one of the very first ones that comes to mind, is in the form of managing your risk with your exposures at the end. And this one is less focused about strategy, right? This is more going to be about your personal risk tolerance. But SaberSim, by default, based on where the sim variance slider mostly is set for your particular contest, is going to give you an approach to this here by saying it's the maximum exposure it makes sense to play for this particular contest is 70% exposure as your highest owned player on the slate. But that may not be true for every single player, and that may not be true for how you want to approach the particular contest. So this is less focused on strategy, right? This is a little bit more diversification, differentiation, risk tolerance, volatility, that kind of thing. But a good spot to add value is just making sure that these exposures actually make sense for what percentage of lineups you want to include a player and how many raw lineups you want to have that particular player in it. But from there, more on the strategy standpoint, I think making smart adjustments to the individual inputs can be a very good spot to add value. First of all, I'm gonna just pause for a second here, and I see there are some questions coming in live here. I'm gonna continue rolling through what I have kind of prepared for this question, and then we'll get to the questions that are coming in live here. But what I mean in particular, by adjusting the inputs here is our projections, and simulations are very good, but almost every single slate, there's often some situation that might be inherently difficult to project. Maybe it's because it's an injury situation that leads to a team playing in an unconventional way. Last night, the weather situation makes an inherently difficult situation to kind of predict. And maybe you have a new coach or a trade or some situation that is creating uncertainty, right? Those are situations that are difficult for models to predict in general. Digging into these kinds of situations and either doing a little bit of your own research to see if there's a reason to pivot from who we are assuming might benefit from this new situation in the form of getting additional minutes or carries or targets is a really good idea, right? Because these are going to be situations that any model is going to struggle with. And I think you can even afford to sometimes just take a game theory approach here and just zig where the field is going to zag and assume that when the starting running back gets hurt, that the backup is going to be in a timeshare instead of getting the bulk of the workload or something like that. Beyond just projections, I think looking at ownership, I talk about adjusting ownership constantly, even yesterday, I think can be a really sharp idea here because it is difficult for a computer, and we have a computer-based, an algorithmic-based ownership model. It's difficult sometimes for that to predict how the field is going to react. Making some adjustments to ownership projections overall on in the ownership projections to just identify who the top overall plays are going to be, right? Or how your individual contest is going to handle ownership can be a very great value add to the process, right? You're instead of focusing on what's happening in the lineup construction process, you adjust the inputs here. If you're playing single entry, if you're playing high stakes, right, you're going to have a sense of the ownership condensing on the consensus best fields on the slate, right? Maybe Kupp is 40% owned and Jonathan Taylor is 35% owned, etc. I think even in a situation like last week where we had the Sony Michel situation, right? That's a difficult situation to think about from an ownership standpoint. But maybe you had a sense that there was going to be that Michel's ownership was going to come down after the Darrell Henderson news came out, right? I think the model assumed that the field was going to play optimally and continue basically just jamming in Michel. But that might have been a good situation to identify and say, no, you know what? I think the field's going to get off this guy. There's a lot of running back value on the slate. The uncertainty around this situation, I think, is going to create an edge there, right? The last note overall that I think is a really good spot to add value, and it's a little bit of a big concept here, or kind of a wider concept, is finding your edge on the slate, right? Again, I mentioned here kind of at the start of answering this question that what your process ends up looking like with a traditional tool ends up being a lot of rule setting and group setting and procedural stuff to make lineups that make sense. And on SaberSim, I think you can afford to spend that time instead really thinking about strategy. When you build a particular set of lineups, the builder is going to give you in your top 20 or 150 or whatever it is, it's going to probably be exploiting an edge somewhere, right? You can often kind of see it by just sorting by this leverage column, right? In this particular case, the fade, right, just by default for last week's game, was of these cheaper Raiders pieces, which actually probably would have worked out pretty well. The Minnesota game, the Cincinnati game, in favor of playing Tampa Bay, Rams, etc. Right? But you have typically a lot of diversity in your pool overall. If you look at your entire pool of 500 lineups, what ends up ultimately showing up in your top 20 or 150 is really just a kind of a small sample, or is it a single or a small set of edges that are available to exploit for the particular slate. It doesn't have to be necessarily the edge that you are exploiting on the slate. So if you can spend some of your time thinking about strategy here, of what do you think the field is going to do? What do you think is inefficient about the market of the particular slate you were playing, and how can you exploit it, knowing that you don't have to spend your time setting the rules to build the lineups to exploit it. They're already there. You just need to find them. I think that is the highest value thing you can do with SaberSim overall. And I get that that's broad. So some examples of what that might look like. Maybe you're playing an NFL Showdown slate and there's a heavy favorite in the game. Maybe it's 8-point spread, something like that, right? Sitting down and thinking, maybe you set the premise that the field is going to overly play 4-2 and 5-1 stacks for that particular team on the slate. So you are instead going to pivot and build 4-2 and 5-1 stacks of the underdog on the game, right? Or we mentioned before the idea of the starter running back getting hurt, right? So the backup's coming in. Maybe you assume that you're going to be playing with a timeshare for that particular running back. The chalkiest running back on the slate is the backup running back. The field is going to assume he's going to get all the work, and you make an assumption of a timeshare in that particular slate and make some adjustments to the projections or just cap your exposure to that player in step 3, right? Another one would be the example of maybe the Bucks are playing in a game with a big spread and the field is going to assume that the game blows out and Giannis doesn't get his maximum amount of minutes. You instead take the stance that the game stays close. You get over the field on your exposure to Giannis and get him at lower ownership because of the spread of the game of what the average outcome is before the start of the slate. What is consistent about all 3 of these examples, and what I think you should try to do when you're thinking about these things, is come up with something with a premise, a reason for taking an action that you can validate after the slate in a way that is not dependent on how many fantasy points the player actually scored. So going back to these, the lineup construction one on the NFL Showdown, you could go and validate that the field played more of 4-2 and 5-1 stacks of the favorite than the underdog, right? You could go in and validate, even if the backup running back ends up breaking a 50-yard touchdown and ends up being the play, you could check the carries of a certain player and see, was I right about that, right? You could see overall, were you right about ownership? Did you, regardless of the outcome of the game of whether maybe the Bucks blow out the team anyway, did you get Giannis at 5% ownership on a 6-game slate, right? And manage to get leverage on that player in a way that was strategically correct, even if the outcome didn't take place exactly in the way that benefited you on that night, right? So the last note I kind of want to come to with this question here is judging your results, right? Because I think the final part of the question here is figuring out, are you running bad or is your process wrong, right? I think I talked about this recently in a lot of detail. Actually, I'm going to pull it up here. On our YouTube page, under this catch up on the latest office hours live streams, this video, why your NBA DFS process should take 15 minutes or less, which was actually right after that day we had the crazy Giannis news. This section, so all these videos are timestamped, but this section, tracking past results quantitatively and qualitatively, is a much more detailed breakdown of how I think you can go about tracking your results in a way that is process-driven rather than, or not, I don't even want to say tracking your results. Checking your process in a way that is process-driven versus like ROI results-driven. But a few ways that I talked about in that particular video, you can do something like check your top 1% equity. I think that's a very quantitative approach using a tool like RotoTracker or something out there and just seeing how often your lineups are placing in the top 1%. But I think the more interesting way, the way that's a little bit more intuitively tied to the ideal SaberSim process, is taking a qualitative approach of judging these edges or these stances of the way you're approaching the slate and seeing if the premises were accurate, right? I mean, you can see here, just looking at this, we have 500 lineups and we're trying to come up with 20, and we don't have any more. We have at most 34% of one player in the pool, right? You could come up with a set of 20 lineups that really accomplished almost anything, right? For realistically any player on the slate, right? And I think some of this can just be done from, again, that like game theory standpoint of zigging where the field is going to zag. But maybe your approach was that the Washington football team isn't willing to give Gibson the full split of carries, right? Because McKissick's out, right? And they haven't used Gibson as a bell cow back at all this year, and maybe it's next man up for that backup running back, and maybe you're going underweight on a guy like Gibson, right? You don't even have to make this stuff up. This can be, I'm making it up on the fly here, but this can be benefited by doing your own individual research, reading other content, watching other videos, things like that, coming up with this stuff here. But the finding and setting an edge and basically saying like, this is kind of my stance, or these are my stances on the slate, and using SaberSim to support you in the lineup construction portion of that process, I think is like the perfect way to use the tool. And I definitely get that is going to be a more general, potentially a little bit more of a vaguer response to this kind of question. But as we move from answering questions about like, how do I set a stacking rule? What is the leverage column? What does the correlation slider do, right? We're taking a step up here kind of in terms of the overall kind of, level of the question. The questions get a little bit harder to answer in an explicit way. So, Jack, hopefully this was kind of helpful, at the very least in shedding some light over the lineup building process on SaberSim and where I think the spots are that you should really leave things alone, which really is that lineup construction component. In terms of where you're going to add value, that's where it definitely gets a little hairier, and it's going to depend on your individual player style. But I think you will see a common trend in a lot of our content is that, whether it's me or Max or Matt or anybody else that kind of makes some videos about what they're doing in their process, it is targeted at that particular part in the process. None of us, I guess, put another way, none of us are spending a lot of time trying to dial in a ton of rules to make the lineup construction process better, right? You have on Max's, this video is just playing in the background. I'm glad it was muted, right? Max's recent video about his NBA DFS process, you see him diving into situations where he's getting a lot of exposure to certain players or teams on an NBA slate, or situations where a player is injured, and then looking at the rotations of those teams and trying to find an edge by adjusting inputs to figure out where minutes might fall in a way that people aren't predicting, right? He's not spending time dialing in the actual individual lineup construction or setting rules or anything like that for how his NBA lineups are going to be constructed, but he's changing the inputs for who's going to end up ultimately being used in the lineups. If you've watched my NFL videos, right, this one is a good, or NFL or MLB, building high upside NFL DFS lineups with SaberSim. This is a video of my NFL process. And then also the same video for baseball, a video of my baseball process, right? A lot of what I try to do is my process of finding the edge, right? Like I've said here a couple times, my process of doing that is running research builds to find ownership inefficiencies on certain players so that I can find situations where even if SaberSim builds my 500 lineups and finds that the initial optimal pool of 20 includes 75% Antonio, or 75% Antonio Gibson. If I find that the 14% ownership is inefficient for Gibson, then I want to be under or completely fade him, despite the fact that this is kind of what popped up as my initial 20. And I find that adds value to my process, but that's strategic rather than procedural in terms of setting rules. That is the biggest takeaway I can have here, is try to focus the things that you are doing to add value in a strategic way, and in maybe an exploitative way would be another way of putting that, rather than try to make the lineups themselves be better constructed, because that's the thing that SaberSim does very well pretty much on its own. So I'm going to leave that there. Big question. Talked about that for about half an hour. We'll hit these follow-up questions that have come in YouTube chat. Jack, I will get you a link to the recording here, just in case you aren't watching me live. Not sure if you were able to make this one. And if you have follow-up questions here, let me know. But really good question there. So, okay. So, Rand said, "Hey team, bring back the 5,000 lineup pools, por favor." I frankly wasn't even aware that we ever had 5,000 lineup pools. At least as far as I'm aware, this is, even on the older version of the app, has always been limited to 1,500. So I'm not entirely sure how you might have been getting I'm not exactly sure how you might have been getting 5,000 lineups, but let me know. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something here. Daniel said, going off all the info you just gave, would you change the sliders for a small slate like tonight's NBA? If you would, how much would you change it by? So this is basically like the perfect example of what I would not focus your attention on, right? The builder is likely by default to take the information that you're giving it in step one and building lineups that are viable, that make sense for the contest you are playing with the settings in step two. And your time spent dialing into how you want to build your optimal lineup, or dialing in what lineups you want to use for tonight's 3-game slate, is better spent on a strategic approach of trying to figure out, is there an inefficiency of how minutes are being projected? Is there an injury situation that is inherently difficult to project? Is the field inefficiently owning certain players? Are players more or less likely to be owned relative to their expectation of success? And how can I exploit that in the actual, either in step one in the form of editing projections or ownership, or in step three in the selection process of the lineups I'm using? But editing your sliders in step two is changing essentially the rules of how those lineups are created, and I think is the lower value spot to do things in your process. Lord Pi said, is the SaberScore just a comparison amongst the lineups generated? Yes. So SaberScore only applies within a given build. You cannot and you should not compare SaberScores between builds. So SaberScore purely compares the lineups built in that individual build amongst each other. It's always normalized to 100. The highest SaberScore, the best lineup that we feel that is in the pool is always SaberScore 100. But you should not comparing one lineup from one build and saying it has a SaberScore of 98 to another lineup in another build that has a SaberScore of 85 and making a determination that one is better than the other is not a good approach. The lineups, SaberScore only compares lineups within the individual build. So I think I'm missing maybe something here too. Z-score, so to speak, regarding SaberScore. Okay, I am not sure. I don't think, mathematically speaking, the SaberScore is a Z-score, but I'd have to talk to Matt to get a little more information on that. Six says, aside from the high upside NFL video, are there any other videos you would recommend to help a new SaberSim user sharpen the process of honing in lineup builds? So, to be totally clear, these videos do kind of this is intended to kind of be watched as a bit of a course here. So my video to my process, this high upside NFL lineups, SaberSim, is the last video here in this NFL course, so to speak, because it counts on an understanding of some of the concepts in a lot of these other videos. And also it's intended to be just an option of how to build. It's basically intended to be like, this is how I apply all of these different concepts into my actual process, but this isn't the only way to do that. So, I mean, I know there's a lot of content here. I mean, this is like probably 12 hours or so of videos here. But it really, if you were interested in more content of how to especially sharpen in the process of building your lineups, I would watch the rest of the course. At the very least, in particular, the contest selection video, which are the first two in both of these NBA. The first two videos in both the NFL and the NBA course are contest selection. And then the ultimate guides, or the 4 keys, these two videos for both NFL and NBA are also very important in kind of setting the stage. These are the most important concepts you need to successfully build your lineups, right? So, like, again, in this video, I am kind of taking for granted, I guess, that there's an understanding of leverage and ownership and correlation and these other concepts that are very important for NFL when we get to this video. So all of that to say, I think the best videos to add on to this are the ones that precede it in the course. And to come at this video and Max's video too, from the NBA side, from the standpoint that this is presenting a way to add value to the SaberSim process that is strategic in nature, amongst a huge variety of different approaches to your process. So hopefully that kind of that kind of helps. I realize this question is basically just like, what video should I watch next? And I don't know if I really helped answering that, but really, I mean, truly, if you're looking for more NFL content, watch the other videos in the NFL course. And some of the stuff may not apply to you. If you don't play cash games, skip the cash games one. But I think how to find the best NFL DFS stacks is also a really good video. That is kind of a stepping stone from some of the more basic concepts that will be presented in like this ultimate guide video, and how I'm getting here to doing my process at the end, right? So anyway, I'm going to move us along for now here and hit one other question that came in before the start of the stream today in support. And let's go ahead and get to this one here. Okay. This is from Josh. And this is about NFL as well. He says, my one question so far, on a week with a lot of injury news, such as this week's, it seems like we basically have to wait until Sunday morning to click the build lineups button. However, I like to fine tune my stacks and exposures throughout the week. I know you guys recommend doing most of that in step 3, but it seems like I can't get to step 3 until Sunday morning. Should I just adjust exposures on the step 1 page, or how would you recommend going about that? I don't want to have to wait until Sunday morning to do all of my stack and exposure adjustments, as that just seems super stressful. Hope the question made sense. Yeah, so let's jump over. Let's go back to NFL for week 13. So first of all, on kind of the very practical side here, yes, your exposures and your adjustments and things like that you make on an individual build are going to be for that build, right? And the problem here is that if you run a build on Wednesday or Tuesday, right? It's Tuesday right now. And you dial in all these exposures and things like that, information is going to change throughout the week. Projections are going to change. And you can go back to an individual build and click the little refresh icon, but all that's going to do is resort the lineups that were built on Wednesday for what are the best ones on Sunday, but it's not going to build new lineups, not going to build good new lineups at that point on Sunday. So how can we deal with this particular problem? I think on the practical standpoint, one of the best things you could do would be making adjustments on step 1, right? If you find certain plays that you know you're planning on being over or under the field on early in the week, setting min or max exposures here on step 1, or for example, if you know what particular stacks you're going to be interested in, a very easy way to dial in that is to just curate your quarterback player pool and remove quarterbacks from the pool that you don't want to stack, right? And doing that kind of thing throughout the week as you are doing your research is going to leave you with less you have to do and rush to do on Sunday. However, the big caution sign, the big strategic caution sign I put over all of this is to be careful with the decisions that you are making earlier in the week overall, right? Things change a lot throughout the week, and even situations changing in one game affect the context of the other slate overall, right? If we get news that let's say you had made a leverage-based decision or something like that, or a game theory-based decision that you were going to fade Jamal Williams this week because he was going to be the very chalky this past week because he was going to be the very chalky running back and the Lions suck or something like that, right? That was your research decision. And then we get the news that Darrell Henderson is mostly out and Sony Michel is going to play, and it looks like the field is moving to Sony Michel. Well, the Rams game does not affect the Lions game, but the Rams game affects the ownership of the Lions game. And if you had made some kind of leverage-based decision or some game theory-based decision about that game, you would now really kind of have to pivot and maybe undo some of these exposures and things like that, right? If you have gone in and edited player projections, right, and maybe assumed that you think the model is overly high on a certain team and taken down that team's projections, right? So let's say you were under on the Rams or something like that, right? So you've done this, right? Well, when you get to Sunday, we will not undo this, right? If Matt Stafford's projection has changed from Wednesday to Sunday, it is still going to remain at what your custom projections set it at here earlier in the week. So I would be cautious overall about making too many adjustments early in the week. One, for the reason of like strategy and like an anchoring bias that news changes throughout the week, and your strategy should change from what it looks like it's going to be on Wednesday to Saturday night and Sunday morning. But also from the practical standpoint of like, if you have put things into the app that were optimal strategically on Wednesday, they may become suboptimal by Sunday. Or if you've set exposure settings, right, that are no longer game theory optimal moves on Sunday morning, right, that can hurt you more than that can help you. So I know Sundays can be a little bit stressful. The hour leading up to lock, if you feel like you have a ton of things to do right before lock, it can feel like a lot. And if you are stuck between the decisions of not being able to do the things you want to do to your lineups because you don't have enough time and you waited till Sunday versus doing some of those things a little bit earlier, then I think you should make some of those changes earlier in the week, and you should do so on step one. But I would wait as long as you can, to be totally frank. And I think really doing I think research is fine throughout the week, but starting to make changes to projections or exposures or stacking rules or things like that in a way that you intend to keep all the way through Sunday morning, you should be very cautious of doing that too early in the week, because the news is going to change quite a bit. So yeah, anyway. Josh, let me know if that helps. I'll get you a recording to this section of the stream here. If you have any more follow-up questions, let me know. Happy to help there. Six said, just to clarify my situation, seasoned NFL DFS player and have an understanding of the basics here, and want to target content that you can consume to familiarize yourself with SaberSim, specifically to take full advantage of the technology and gain an edge by using the simulator to its fullest potential. Yeah, got it. And I totally get that. I think there can still be, I think there's still a lot of value in watching some of these videos here earlier in the course. I don't mean to intend that, like, I didn't mean to give off the impression that like this video is only for total beginners that have never played an NFL DFS slate in their life, right? A lot of what this video includes is some more breakdowns of like how the builder's actually working and the things that it is automating for you. I think it's still a useful watch. But I do think if you are interested in another video and have been playing NFL DFS for a while and have a pretty strong sense of the general roster construction concepts, you might also find this video interesting, which is with Matt and Will. Matt built SaberSim and Will is our data scientist, talking about actually how the NFL simulations work, how we actually simulate NFL games in a play-by-play way. Knowing how this works will, I think, help understand how the lineup construction component of SaberSim a little bit more. And once you have that, I think it's easier to apply some more strategic concepts from there. So I check out these videos as well. Cool. Too Short said, what's the fastest way to pivot off of one player from a lineup post build? I like the whole lineup, but want to pivot off one high-owned player. Okay. To be completely honest, there's not a very easy way to do that right now in the app. This is something we've talked about. Matt has actually said that this is pretty firmly in our product roadmap, but it's not something you can very easily do right now. So like say, for example, you loved this lineup, but you wanted to pivot off of Cooper Kupp, right? There's not really a good remove Cooper Kupp and put in this guy instead at the moment here, unfortunately. You can make your pivots on a broader exposure level here, right? And you could say that I actually want to be under the field on Cooper Kupp across all of my lineups, but there's really not a great way to just say, take this lineup, remove this player, and put this one in instead at the moment, unfortunately. But it's something we do want to add. So, okay, cool. A few other questions here came in through Slack here earlier this morning. Riku said, could you look to add a tab for cumulative ownership alongside product ownership? This would be particularly valuable for shorter and showdown slates. Yeah, I think ownership product in general is probably just better than ownership sum. We have ownership sum right now. We don't have ownership product. I can talk to the team about adding ownership product. We don't want to make this unnecessarily busy here at the end, but I do think it's probably even more useful than ownership sum. So I'll talk to the team about adding that in here. Phantom has a question here about an entry editor technique that Ross mentioned. So he said in the NFL channel, Ross had a good technique in the NFL channel about how to add different sets of lineups to various 20 maxes. Is there a quick way to do this in the entry editor, or would you have to download your CSV of 100 lineups and copy paste each set? You do have to do some copy and pasting. Since this is referring to Ross's, well, you don't have to do this in the CSVs. There's a couple ways to do this. Let me first of all summarize what Ross's approach was. So he mentioned that one thing he likes to do with his entries is to make a large pool. So say you're playing like 5 different 20 max contests, right? And Ross says he likes to make a large pool of unique lineups and then save subsets of that larger pool to apply to higher dollar contests. So if you had 100 lineups in 5 different 20 maxes, hypothetically, oh God, this didn't come through well. 20 in the $20, 20 in the $3, 20 in the $1, 20 in the 25-cent, and 20 in the 10-cent, right? That's the idea. And Ross mentioned here that one thing that he likes to do is save the top 20 in one particular set, then save the other 20 in another set, save the other 20 in another set after that, and then apply them all in the entry editor. I think that's definitely one way to do it. I think the one thing that's tedious there is, for example, you would have your one set here. Well, let's reset exposures. If we were doing that, right, we would have our first set here of lineups, and then I believe we'd have to go in and remove manually the first 20 and then check in the next 20 yourselves. I think what would be far more easy here would be to just take your top 100, download it, and then open up the CSV and chop it up. Overall, like, my take on this, so this came from a conversation that is kind of somewhat still in progress here on the NFL channel. That I would, if you're interested in this, I'd go read a little bit more there. But we had a user that was playing the showdown last night, and his best lineup, he entered the dime, the quarter, the play action, the first down, and the milli, right? And he filled his lineups uniquely, and best lineup was in the dime, right? That happens sometimes, right? And then Shady Advice said he wouldn't use unique fill if he was playing contests whose buy-ins were that many order of magnitudes apart. And then there was some kind of conversation about where the breakpoints are overall. I actually have, I'm a little bit behind here now. This looks like there's been some more conversation here. But I do think overall, like, this is a pretty sharp point by Shady Advice here, that I know we typically recommend preaching a unique fill strategy where you're playing all of the best contests and using a unique fill and putting a unique lineup into every contest. At some point, the variance, the raw luck of your lineups, the difference between the payout score, the highest payout possible for you between those lineups is going to be so high that you can't really afford to introduce that level of variance into your lineups, right? When you have that top 0.01% outcome of the lineup, if that is the difference between $100 and $100,000, can you afford to take that particular risk, right? I wouldn't personally. When I'm using unique fill, a lot of times I try to make sure that my lineups, the top payout between the individual contests I'm playing is probably no greater than about an order of magnitude different. So if the highest payout contest I'm playing is $10,000 to first, I don't want to unique fill lineups and allow a lineup to end up in a contest that is paying out less than $1,000 to first. That's particularly my particular line here. What Ross recommends here of using your lineups here and using your top 20 and putting it, your top 20 SaberScore and putting it in your top 20 most expensive entry fees and your 21 to the 40th and your 41st to the 60th and so on, I think can be a good approach to smooth this out. and theoretically put your highest expected value lineups into the best lineups possible. But you are still introducing a lot of that. There's still a lot of variance there, and it's not going to be exact. I'm not necessarily sure on the time horizon that we are all playing on if making sure that your lowest SaberScore lineup ends up in your lowest dollar contest is actually going to amount to anything actionable that's worth spending the time to do it on. I think overall, my personal take on this conversation is that if the difference in the potential payout of the different contests you are playing in is significant enough that you would be upset to have a lineup land in one contest versus another, you probably should be rank filling those lineups, right? And for me, that's about one order of magnitude. But that's an individual kind of player distinction. So, I realize that I'm kind of like tacking on to an existing conversation in Slack. If you weren't in Slack following along this conversation, might have gotten a little bit lost here. In terms of the original question here, I guess the original question was more procedural of how you would do this. So like just following up here, wrapping up this question. If you have 100 lineups in 5 different 20 maxes, right? How would you go about getting those into your individual contests where they are ordered in order of SaberScore? I think personally the easiest way to do that is to download your CSV, and let me share my Excel file so you guys can see that instead. Okay. Oh, hold on one sec. Okay. Okay. So I think the easiest thing would be to download this CSV file and to take lineups like this, 20, right? And that's your first 20, your highest SaberScore lineups, and paste that into your entries file in the most expensive contest, and then go from there. You won't be able to use the entry editor, is one thing, but I actually think this is faster than doing it the slow way, which is creating individual sets of lineups. Creating individual sets of lineups in SaberSim and then applying them to the entry editor like one at a time. That's just personally my take. But I don't think that you actually add much. I don't think you reduce the variance there enough to make it worth it if you're talking about the difference between a lineup. I mean, in the original example that's in Slack, right? This user played a unique set of lineups in the dime and all the way up to the milli, right? So you're talking about a difference of probably $100 to $1 million, depending on the pure luck of where that lineup ends up. I don't know if I would feel comfortable enough saying, well, my 40th SaberScore lineup, and it ended up in the dime. Anyway, yeah, Matt said that answers my question. Thanks, Jordan. I'm kind of rambling here now. Probably my cue to stop talking about this particular question here. It is fun though, right? I've thought about this quite a bit. Because the variance can work out in your favor no matter how you cut it. It can also work out not in your favor. You can have the fortune of throwing a lineup into the milli that was your 80th lineup you built, and by pure luck it lands in the right contest. Like we don't have enough time horizon. We're not going to be able to play enough slates to realize the actual difference in expected value of your lineup that is your first SaberScore lineup and your 80th, realistically speaking. So anyway, I'll let this question go. Matt said, no, you're good. I appreciate the insight. Yeah, I'll let this question go, and we'll move on here. I think we're close to the end here of our questions. 6 said, is there a SaberSim Discord setter? There's not a Discord. We do have a Slack community. There's an invite link to join the Slack community in the description of any past Office Hours video. So if you just go find an old Office Hours video, you can click any of these, and good, we're already muted. In the description, there's a link to join Slack. long term, we are planning on moving to Discord. It's a better platform for what we're trying to do, but we're on Slack for now. So. Joel posts an interesting question here, and I think we're missing the second half of it, but he said, coming back to the black box thing, I saw Saber had projected San Jose 3 versus Calgary 2.6 tonight. Can't find anything, news, injury, history to verify this upset. Personally, I'll be... And actually, it's almost a little poetic that the second half of this question is missing, because I think that's a little bit kind of the point. Yeah, so he says, personally, I'll be swapping those projections, but I feel guilty because maybe Saber knows something I don't. So I don't, like, okay. I want to think very carefully about what I'm going to say here. So that is like the perfect example here of where I think SaberSim is going to offer you up an edge, right? That isn't necessarily the one you have to take. If you build your lineups, it's likely, especially if we are projecting this game as an upset and Vegas has it flipped the opposite direction, right? First of all, that may change throughout the day. In fact, I think probably the most likely outcome is that this will get a little bit closer to what the Vegas odds actually are throughout the day. But assume it doesn't. It's going to offer you up an edge. And maybe you take that edge, right? Coming back to this question we talked about at the start of the stream, I kind of glossed over the idea that you can just roll with what SaberSim's giving you too. You don't necessarily need to have your written edge every single slate. Maybe you think they're right. Maybe you think the projections and what the kind of lineups you're getting as your first 20 or first 150 are just right. You like the plays you're getting positive leverage on. You like the plays you are getting negative leverage on, and you're just good to go. You don't need to do anything from there. But this can be your situation where maybe you are rejecting kind of the initial strategic edge that the builder's giving you, right? Maybe this isn't your optimal strategy for how to play the slate. Then maybe you come up with something else, right? And again, I'm going to be out of my element talking about hockey a little bit. Full disclosure. Okay, Joel said, yeah, it already changed. Yeah. But maybe you're finding an edge elsewhere, right? Maybe Florida's overowned. You know? So, but I think, again, like thinking, like spending your time thinking about the strategic decisions of what lineups you are using is where it makes sense to spend your time. So, but anyway, Adam says, sometimes when SaberSim is right on the team totals, I mix them up myself just as a way to get some natural differentiation relative to the field, especially on Showdown. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think there's sometimes a bit, even for me, one thing and I'm not a big, my overall favorite like strategic approaches for DFS in general often are not about updating projections, right? If you watch the show, you already know that. I do a lot more in exposures than as opposed to editing projections, but when editing projections, I think there is sometimes a little bit of an obsession about trying to be hyper accurate, right? And focusing on like, do I think this is actually the better mean outcome for this player? And I think just taking a stance from the standpoint of differentiating, or just playing the game theory approach, especially on showdowns, right? Adam's perfect right on here, where the average outcome matters less, I think can be a really strong approach, right? Just taking a different stance, right? You don't have to necessarily be right, but put yourself in a position to be profitable when you're right. So, I was looking at this ownership projection. Yeah, our ownership projections are definitely not there for the week yet. A little early, but Cody says, I've personally dropped the dimes because of this. Like, yes, I'm probably leaving some EV on the table, but does winning it matter to me? Yeah, I think it's just ultimately depends on what your contest selection mix looks like, right? And especially if you're uniquely filling your lineups, you're gonna have to draw a line somewhere. You can't just continue to play higher and higher stakes of contests indefinitely using a unique fill method unless you are willing to just play a very, very potentially dangerous dice roll kind of game. I mean, it can work out in your favor, but I mean, there's even for the best players, it's not necessarily even for the best player maxing out the milli maker every single week for their entire life. Their expectation might still not be to win it even once. So if you're going to be playing the milli maker and unique filling it along with $1.10 and 25-cent contests, you're taking a pretty big risk there. But if you have a spread of contests that are all between 25 cents and $5 to enter with relatively similar prize pools and prizes to first, right? I think by rank filling those, you're also taking unnecessary risk, right? Or like, let's say you're playing 5 different single entries and they're $1, $3, $5, and $12. And the $1 pays out 500 to first and the $12 pays out 2,000 to first. And if you make the decision that you're going to rank fill those, you can use the same lineup in all 4, right? You might actually, in that case, be introducing additional risk to your lineups unnecessarily, because really the difference between winning $500 and $1,200 is, for me, I guess, at least, and I don't necessarily have the math to back this up, but the difference between those 2 first prizes wouldn't be so much that I would want to go all in on one lineup in all 4 contests. So it does depend a little bit on the payout structure of the contest, how many lineups you're playing, and so on. So, but cool. Okay, I am going to go ahead and leave things there for today's stream. It was a good one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We spent a long time talking about this black box question, hopefully pulling back the curtains on some of the black boxes on SaberSim, but also generally talking about where your best opportunities to add value are and where you should leave SaberSim mostly alone, which again, just to summarize, I think the best spaces to add value, the best places to add value in general on SaberSim are in your strategic components of your process and less about trying to set rules and control the actual lineup construction component of your process. But we also talked a little bit about and how to judge your process, especially if you're trying to avoid being results focused. We talked a little bit about avoiding necessarily getting too tunnel visioned on news coming out earlier in the week, making too many changes on SaberSim for NFL early in the week. But also, if you want to make some adjustments early in the week, how to go about doing that. We talked a little bit about what else? I guess variance, contest selection, rank versus unique fill was kind of the last big block of topics here. So good stream overall. Definitely dove into some questions and some topics that were unique, not stuff we talk about every day. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. We will be right back here again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern. So if you have questions as you're setting your lineups for tonight's NHL or NBA sites or otherwise, feel free to fire them into the Office Hours channel in Slack. We'll get to them tomorrow. Otherwise, email us, support@sabersim.com. Good luck tonight, and we'll see you tomorrow. See ya.